Okay. Welcome to our Parsha discussion. This is the last Parsha of the Sefer. So we've completed four-fifths of the mitzvot of the week. Well, not really because we didn't do Vayikra, but that's okay. Um, and this week's is a really interesting mitzvah. I didn't love it, but I thought it was worth confronting the dislike. So I will explain. It has to do with Nedarim. We'll look at a sort of a chunk of we'll skim a chunk of our parsha about what is called Hafarat Nedarim, an annulment of vows. And Rav Tabori starts his article with this quote from Chagiga, and I was trying to find some interesting, beautiful, poetic expression similar to this. Because I think it's a really interesting way to frame the piece, so this is a Mishnah from Chagiga that is actually, of course, not totally talking about Nidarim, but um, the thought, the sentiment that is expressed is Heter Nidarim porchin ba'avir, that they fly out into the air. Like that words, the dissolution of vows is like weightless in some way. Ve'ein lahem al ma sheyismechu, that they don't have anything on which to rely on in the Torah. And so you can see that the Rashi or whatever it is that Sefaria is quoting here is helping us understand, right, that there's only a slight allusion to the dissolution of vows in the Torah in our Parsha, and it's this chunk. And the rest of the dissolution of vows is sort of weightless. It's not anchored in a way that the rabbis of the Gemara feel happy about. And I think that part of what's really interesting about this mitzvah is that it's one of those highly conditional mitzvot. If you make a vow, then you want to dissolve it, then you can feel this mitzvah of dissolving, but it's not like you should make lots of vows just so you can dissolve them, right? The rabbis sort of frown upon neder making in general, right? When we say things colloquially, we often say bli neder, right? I'll do that for you, which is like vow language, bli neder, without making it a formal vow. And I actually saw Rav Ari was mentioned that someone who had been a vegetarian for many, many years, like decades even, decided to stop being a vegetarian and she annulled the vow of her vegetarianism, right? That like I think what's attractive to Nidarim is this idea that our words carry a lot of power, a lot of weight, that it's not just our actions, but the way that we express ourselves is also really important. And so important that when we aren't going to do the thing, there has to be some kind of mechanism to let us out. But you might think that that's just like the remedy, and instead it's being framed as a mitzvah. And I think that that's like where I'm still sort of trying to wrap my mind around it. Um, but this idea that like it's not the words that fly in the air and become weightless, but the annulment that I think reinforces sort of the beauty of how important our words are and how carefully we have to choose them. And it is the mitzvah in this week's parsha. So, this, uh-oh, hold on. It's not letting me pull my screen down. Sometimes I irritatingly have to stop sharing and try again. Let's see. Hello, Nelson. Hello, Judith. I didn't see you guys. A benefit to having to stop sharing for a minute. Okay, here we go. I'm not sure. I don't understand these days where it won't move the screen, but we'll start here and we'll go forward. So the Torah is telling us about a woman who is ki tidur neder la Hashem. She makes some kind of vow, or v'asra isar, or she assumes some kind of obligation. Bebeit aviha betnu ureha. So now we're talking about a young woman. Interestingly, not a young man, but a young woman in her father's house. And she makes some kind of vow, and we'll see what kind of vows these might be. V'shama aviha et nidra ve'asraha, asher asra al nafsha, v'hechrish la aviha, v'kamu kol nadraha, v'chol isar asher asar al nafsha yakum. So her father learns of her vow, right? You can imagine this being very dramatic or very mundane, right? I vow not to eat any cupcakes, right? Or I vow I'm not going to listen to my father and marry someone he doesn't approve of, right? It could be any kind of drama, high or low. The father hears about the vow or the self-imposed obligation and offers no objection. I don't care if you eat cupcakes, or actually, I think that's a wonderful young man, right? All her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand. So this young woman has some level of autonomy as long as her father agrees with her, right? She can take that really strong step of making a neder as long as her father agrees with her. But if her father restrains her, Henia aviha, on the day that he hears about her vows, lo yakum, then they don't stand. And we'll sort of have to look and see, is this like a cancellation or a nullification moving forward, right? Does if she makes the vow on Monday, the father hears about it on Wednesday, was the vow in effect on Tuesday, or has he just made the whole thing null and void? That's a little bit unclear here. Um, but he can cancel the vow, v'Hashem yislach la, and God will forgive her for having made that vow and not fulfilled it because her father withheld her from it. Right? So it seems as though God is actually invested in the father having this obligation or obligation, to watching his daughter's speech patterns. Um, then, of course, if she sort of transfers herself from under her father's thumb to under her husband's thumb, right? Then the husband has the same opportunity to annul or cancel the vow moving forward. Sorry, I'm just going to make us a little dizzy, but I'm going to have to keep stopping and resharing because it doesn't seem to allow me to move down. Um, okay, so now we see, right? The husband, it's a very similar pattern of the husband also being allowed to cancel her vow. Then let's see how much we can fit on one page here. So we can check again. Um, the Torah goes on to tell us um, if her husband annuls the vow and right, God will forgive her just the same way. And then Pasuk Yud, every vow and every sworn obligation of self-denial may be upheld by her husband or annulled by her husband. And this is where the term Hafarat comes from, right? So if he upholds it, Yekimenu, V'isha Yeferanu is a Hafara, right? Then it will be annulled. And if he finds out about it but doesn't offer an objection automatically, then that's sort of on him, right? It has to be automatic. You can't like change your mind about it, right? Oh, if your wife swears to be a vegetarian and you say, fine, I don't really care, but then you learn that means she's not going to cook meat in her house, and you're like, well, wait a second, I want, roast and Shabbat dinner, then it's too late. It has to be done at the time in which it happens. And then Pasuk Zayin, right? Ela hachukim asher tzivah Hashem, right? So it certainly seems as though there is some kind of mitzvah at play here, right? Right? We'll see a husband and his wife, and between a father and his daughter. This is the mitzvah. So it's a very long section, and it's very technical, and it seems clearly to be a mitzvah. So what do we? How do we go from here? So Rev Tabori offers us a few different ways to think about what is the mitzvah here and how does it work. So the Rambam is number one. And as always, there are a few different ways to think about what the Rambam is thinking about, right? So in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam talks about vows in a few different places. He says, Kol hanedarim v'hashvuot ha'av mefer b'yom sham'o, right? A father can nullify vows or oaths on the day that he hears his daughter take them, right? As we mentioned. And it could be any oath. It can be about, I think if we think about sort of like parental obligation, right? About her well-being, about any sort of thing that she thinks about or wants to do. Aval habal, eno yachol lahafer, ela kol hanedarim ushvaot, sheyesh bahen inui nefesh, o shehem b'dvarim shebeino leveina. Right, so I think that's a really interesting point here, is that the husbands can only nullify vows that are inui nefesh, that are like dangerous to her, is maybe the way I would say them, right? I think the cupcake one is a great example. If she vows not to eat cupcakes, fine, but if she vows not to eat anything, right? If she has like a challenge in thinking about how she looks, then he could annul that. He could say, well, you have to eat again. or things that affect their marriage. And the examples, of course, are sort of dated. For example, kigon shenishba o nedra shelo tichal, that she won't wear makeup, or shelo titkashet, or she won't wear jewelry, right? If she is doing something that makes her husband upset and it feels like it's for her husband, then he can annul that vow. But he can't annul a vow for her not to speak to her best friend or for her to want to get a PhD, right? Like it has to be something that really affects their internal relationship or is bad for herself. And then the Rambam talks about this question that we were talking about when and how the nullification of the vow works. So here, sorry, it's so choppy today. He says, Ketzad mefar, right? How does he nullify? He says, Omer mufar o batel, right? It's nullified or it's void or ein neder zeh klum. This has no consequence. Um, or some other term, she'akirat haneder me'ikaro, right? That it has to be nullified from the outset. Ben befaneha, ben shelo befaneha. So I think part of what upset me about this content is this idea that like a woman could say something with the full weight of her words, and then totally unbeknownst to her, those words are erased, right? Her husband could overhear her saying it to her friend and then annul her vow before she even knows that it's annulled. Like, and I understand the world was a different place, right? But I think that there's something disturbing about the idea that someone could annul your vow without you even knowing it. Right? The idea usually hatarat nedarim or hafarat nedarim is where you go before a beit din of three people and you ask to nullify to sort of be let out of your vow. And so, on the one hand, this is actually very beautiful. The people who are supposed to love her and care for her most can look out for her best interests, and she doesn't have to present it, right? She could say something in the heat of frustration, and she can totally have it annulled without having to like own that consequence in any way. On the other hand, it takes away a lot of her autonomy here. And so I would be tempted, I think, to not count it as a mitzvah, right? It's like it's disturbing. It's not, it's one of those weird mitzvah where like if she never makes a neder, then the husband can never have this mitzvah. Right? I think maybe we talked about this with tzitzit, right? If you choose to never wear a four-cornered garment, then you don't have to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzit. If you choose to live in a tent or on a boat, you never have to um, do the mitzvah of mezuzah, right? They're conditional mitzvot. If you have a wife or a daughter who is really measured and balanced and never takes vows, you'll never be able to do hafarat nedarim for her. But the Rambam lists it quite positively as a positive mitzvah. And so he says here, gosh, it's so frustrating. It's mitzvah 95. And he tells us that this is he shetzivanu ladun b'hafarat nedarim, that a father or a husband is obligated to administer this nullification of vows. Kilomar haTorah shahoranu ladun b'dayanim hahen, right? He that the precept that he instructed us about these laws. That the content is not that we are obligated to annul vows no matter what, right? A woman can make a vow that her husband chooses not to annul. It doesn't have to be annulled. Um, however, um, he can, right? It could be a mitzvah. Um, right. And the Rambam says, anytime you hear me counting one of the mitzvot, it doesn't need to be a command of a specific compulsory um, action. Rather, it is a commandment by virtue of our being commanded to administer this law for this thing when it arises. Right? The Rambam is not bothered by that. He says this is just a different kind of mitzvah. Um, and the Rambam brings this idea from Chagiga, right? So he says, right, the tradition comes and tells us that a sage can also annul a vow, right? Ba hakabala shechacham gam kain matir neder, the gam kain l'shvua, and also for a vow, right? So there's some technical differences between vows and oaths. And it is possible to erase them all, right? And it says that he may not void his word, right? A person who makes a vow can't void it on his own, but a chacham can void it for him. And somehow the Chacham is allowed to do this because the Chacham wants to, right? The annulment floats in the air. It doesn't have a specific root to it.
Jerry. Yeah.
I know, sorry. It's so frustrating. So that's opinion number one. And before I start sharing again, right, just to say, so the Rambam counts this as one of the 613 mitzvot, right? And he explains that it doesn't mean we dafka have to do Hafarat Nedarim. It just means that there is a mitzvah available to us when we need it, right? And he mentions this idea of hatarat nidarim, right? That's what the chacham does. But that is not counted as a separate mitzvah, right? So that maybe this mitzvah, which is definitely rooted, right? There are 26 psukim, I think it was, about hafarat nidarim. And so that counts as a mitzvah straight out, whereas hatarat nidarim is just a rabbinic command that sort of floats in the air, like Chagiga says, right? The Ramban, of course, will disagree strongly with the Rambam here. Let me pull up this piece. And here I gave us part of Rav Shabori's article because I think it's a helpful way to sort of think about these mitzvot and how we think about sourcing mitzvot from the Torah. Okay. So he says the Ramban disagreed with the Rambam and refused to count Hafarat Nidarim as a mitzvah. So he brought us this again from Parsha Chukat, which we actually didn't. I think we looked. Oh no, we did. This is the Chukat was the mitzvah of the cursing, right? Could you curse or could you not curse? And so we saw a similar dispute there about this kind of mitzvah being included. The Rambam counted mitzvot such as the laws of Tuma and Zahara, right, ritual purity, and the Ramban argued that these are merely laws determining personal status rather than an actual mitzvah. And he felt that only obligations and restrictions should be counted. The Ramban writes that there's a positive obligation to fulfill Nedarim, right? If you vow to not eat cupcakes, then when you don't eat the cupcakes, you have fulfilled a Neder and done a mitzvah, as well as a negative mitzvah not to transgress a Neder, meaning not to eat the cupcakes when you've made the vow not to. And Hatara and Hafara are simply the laws instructing us how to avoid the issue of Nedarim rather than mitzvot. I have to say, this to me resonates much more. The Ramban is saying the Torah is giving you the mechanism to get out of a mitzvah, right? If it's not doable for you, if you create an unnecessary mitzvah, then here's the mechanism to get out of it. But that in and of itself, hafara, is not a mitzvah. And to me, it's like I would be so disappointed if I was a father and my daughter never made a neder and I could never do hafarat nedarim. I could never fulfill that mitzvah. It would be like out of my hands. So I'd much rather think about it as a mechanism to get out of the issue of the neder. Um, okay. And he explains what we saw in the Mishnah Torah, right? The two first sources. Um, the Rambam seems to formulate this in a different way, right? And he has a introduction to Hilchot Nedarim where he describes the third mitzvah of this section as follows: to revoke or vow or oath. And this is the law of Hatarat Nedarim explicated in the biblical text. This seems to suggest that there is a real mitzvah incumbent upon a father and husband to do Hafarah. In this case, would there also be a mitzvah upon Beit Din to do Hatarat Nedarim, right? Sort of the way the Chacham does or the Beit Din does, right? Is it a mitzvah? If someone comes and says, I want to do Hatarat Nedarim, is that a mitzvah that like has extra weight, or are you just doing a nice thing for someone who made a mistake? That's the question, right? The Rambam very possibly held that there is indeed such a mitzvah, and for this reason emphasized that hafara is explicit in the biblical text. He perhaps sought to indicate that that hatara too constitutes an actual obligation. Only it could not be counted among the 613 mitzvot because it has no explicit scriptural basis, right? So option number one is that the Rambam is saying it wants to make both hafara and hatara mitzvot, but can only do it for hafara, for the father or husband, because that's explicit in the Torah. Option number two is the Ramban, who says, no, 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 this isn't a mitzvah at all. It's too conditional for it to be a mitzvah. Okay, now option number three is the smak. And the smak, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, there we go, lists this as a mitzvah, 107. And he seems to maintain that there is an actual mitzvah and obligation to perform Hafarat. He quotes the same pasuk, right, that her husband shall revoke it, which suggests an imperative quality to Hafarah. He also cites the comment of Bar Kapara, recorded in the Gemara of Yevamot, that a person should always adhere to three things. I think this list is fascinating. We should think about this list. What are the three things a person should adhere to? Chalitza, right? What is chalitza? Chalitza is if chas v'shalom, your husband passes away and you have no children and he has a living brother, you are supposed to marry the brother, right? Think of the story of Ruth, which is not really a case of chalitza, but is the way, an interesting way of conceptualizing it, right? Her husband died. Maybe Boaz has this obligation to help provide an heir to her husband's legacy or memory. If they don't want to get married for whatever reason, they have to perform chalitza. Chalitza is, again, it's a mechanism to get out of a potential mitzvah that you might not want to do. That's sort of conditional. It's not, everyone doesn't have that obligation, right? Hopefully, your husband doesn't die before you have children. If he does, maybe he doesn't even have a brother. Maybe you really like the brother, you're happy to marry him, right? Chalitza only happens with this like sort of firestorm of weird conditions, weird and tragic conditions. And what does chalitza do? It gives you like really a shalom bayit, because can you imagine if you had to marry your brother-in-law who was horrible to you or just didn't like you or you didn't like him, right? Chalitza is, I think, so similar to Hafarat Nedarim. The second one is to creating peace, which to me feels like maybe the umbrella for both of these, right? Because imagine that a woman makes a neder that really upsets her husband. Hafarat Nedarim is a way of creating shalom bayit, right? If you really don't want to marry your brother-in-law, chalitza is a way of creating shalom bayit. So to me, these seem like the first and the thirds almost seem like examples of the second. What is the purpose of these conditional mechanisms, right? Is to say that maybe these weird mitzvot that sometimes pop up like are really going to create a lack of peace. And this, I think, right, is that um, way of restoring harmony, maybe is the way I would say it, sort of on a meta level. That is not what the Smach or Rav Tabori is saying, but I think it's an interesting piece, that Gemara, to think about Chalitza and Hafarat and Nedarim as sort of similar, because they both are about interfamily dynamics and drama and like issues of control and who has to do what. And so I think the fact that there are these mitzvot that allow you to get out of it is very interesting. Okay. We should note, back to the mitzvah, however, that the Smach at times lists rabbinic laws in his list of Taryag mitzvot. I think that's fascinating. I don't know that we've necessarily encountered that yet, which is to say the Smach, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, is not only listing his deoraita laws, sometimes he lists rabbinic laws in his 613, which to me feels like actually like it changes the playing field of the counting altogether, right? The Ramban and the Rambam have to decide which ones do we keep, which ones do we get rid of if we have to get to 613. The Smach seems not concerned about that because he's willing to add rabbinic laws to the mix as well. So just sort of an interesting process level at the same time. And so because of that, we can't actually say that just because he lists it, he thinks it's Doraita. However, Rav Tabori says because he quotes our pasuk from our parsha, then maybe it actually is a deoraita level mitzvah. Okay, so far are you with me? That like we have the Rambam, definitely a mitzvah, the Ramban, definitely not a mitzvah, and the Smach, who seems to think it's a mitzvah, probably of deoraita status, but at least a Rabbanan status. Okay. The last person that we're going to cite here is Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, and he is going to make a distinction that is helpful here. I wish I could put more of this on the page up on time. Okay. And he is going to say, the same thing as the Smach. So it is a mitzvah in his opinion. And he actually lists two mitzvot asay here, which like to me again feels like a waste. There's so many beautiful mitzvot in the Taryag mitzvot, and here we have these like uncomfortable mitzvot and we're listing them twice. But what does Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon say? How could it be two mitzvot? Because one is incumbent on a father and one is incumbent on a husband. Right? You might not never be a father, but you might be a husband. It would be hard to do it the other way, especially in ancient times. But right, you can imagine a case where your daughter never makes a neder you need to be hafara for, but a husband might have one, or vice versa. And they're two distinct mitzvot in Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon's mind. So you could be a man who is both a father and a husband and only get to fulfill one of these mitzvot, right? Depending on your wife and daughter. It is noteworthy that Rabbeinu Sadia chooses not to include Hafarat Nedarim in his list of communal and court obligations. Right? He's not making this a Beit Din issue. He's saying this is about you as a husband or you as a father. The fact that he instead included it in his list of standard mitzvot assay clearly shows that he disagreed with the Rambam and the Ramban and viewed it as a personal obligation. Right? So this is like we're taking it down into like the weeds a little bit more. The Rambam thinks it's a mitzvah, but it seems to be a communal mitzvah. Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon is saying it's not a communal mitzvah, right? It's not like a mitzvah of reading Torah, for example, right? When we were off cycle with Israel, if you didn't get the right Torah reading, it wasn't such a big deal. It's about the shul, not about the person. Here, Rabbeinu Sadia is saying this is not like that. This is actually on the person himself. And if the mitzvah were to deal with the laws of Hafarat, it would be counted as one mitzvah. By counting two separate mitzvot of Hafarat, Rabbeinu Sadia makes it clear that he considers Hafarat to be an outright personal obligation. So again, I think the sort of thinking, the level that the rabbis are thinking about these internal dynamics in a family is very interesting. And then Rav Tabori leaves us with an interesting question from the Shibulei Haleket. He records the practice to recite a bracha over Hatarat Nedarim. So now we're really bumping it up a notch, right? The Shibulei Haleket, though, strongly disagrees with this custom and writes that the source of the custom is unknown. How did this custom arise? The person who vows is obligated to fulfill the neder. The fact that it can be annulled is not a positive mitzvah which requires a bracha. It's not even a rabbinic obligation. It is merely a remedy prescribed by the Torah, right? It seems as though the Shibulei Haleket, I would say, agrees with the Ramban, right? It's a mechanism. It's just a way to get out of something that you've mistakenly gotten into. And he finishes here, and then we'll have to stop playing this game of moving the page. The Shibbolei Halakhet obviously agrees with the position of the Rambam and the Ramban, and therefore sees no possibility of a brecha. The custom of reciting a brecha would be far more compatible with the approach of Rabbeinu Sadia and the Smak, that there is a biblical or at least rabbinic mitzvah to perform hafara and presumably hatara as well. So he finishes by sort of trying to bring this together again, which again is why even though the content I found to be a little dissonant with our modern perspectives, that the process was really interesting this week, right? So there are these three opinions. The Ramban felt that Hafara and Hatara should not be counted as mitzvot at all, even though they show up in the Torah, right? That's not like it's a prerequisite for something being doraita, but not everything that shows up in the Torah is a mitzvah, and that's the Ramban. The Rambam views them as procedural laws, which he counts as one mitzvah. The Smat held that there is a mitzvah, but it may only be rabbinic. And finally, Rabbeinu Sadia felt that two separate mitzvot are to be counted, and we may reasonably assume that this view prompted the custom recorded by the Shibbolei Haleket to recite a bracha over Hatarat Nedarim, something that he himself, the Shibbolei Haleket, is not comfortable with. And so I think what I want to finish with before we talk about it, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts, is that idea from the Gemara in Yevamot, which is that in some way, whether these are mitzvot or not, they are mechanisms to achieve peace, which is to say that sometimes we find ourselves in weird positions where we feel obligated in ways that are uncomfortable to us, right? Everyone has said at some point, I swear, blah, 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 right? Without really thinking it through. Or, this weird chalitza experience, and that the Torah is so invested in giving us ways to achieve shalom bayit. So maybe this isn't the way that I would want husbands and wives to work out their disagreements today, but I think the fact that it's there to say we can say rash things and our spouses can forgive us, right? Maybe that's the modernizing way that I would sort of explain the text. Or we can say harsh things and our parents will forgive us, that our words carry a lot of weight. But our annulment process can be as like thin as air, is almost a nice balance to say the Torah values our words, but the Torah also values our ability to have shalom bayit. And that the Hafarat system is a beautiful example of that. Again, even if it doesn't maybe resonate with the way we think about relationships today. Okay, I would love to hear what other people have to think about process or about content, whatever you strikes your fancy.
I have a question. Well, two really. The first one is this: promise. Where where do promises end and vows begin?
Hmm.
Promise the same as a vow? If you say, I promise that I will do such, such, and such, have you made a vow, or how do you differentiate?
You mean like in colloquial language?
Pardon?
Like in English, like if you say, I promise I'll return your book to you and then you lose it. Have you broken
That,
a vow?
yeah.
Mm. So, I mean, I think that we have sort of uh, broadened the scope to a high degree, and that's why people say Bli Neder all the time. But the formulas are actually very specific in the Mishnah and the Gemara about what constitutes a vow. And then there are oaths, right? Nedarim, I think, are more like the promise language, and oaths are a little bit different. Shvuot, that's like a whole separate area. But there are ways like I vow not to benefit from or not to give benefit to. Those are like the most common formulas in the Gemara. But
Uh-huh.
there are many of them. But yes, I think I promise is really not enough. I would agree. I think most things we think of as vows are not really. Right. The vegetarianism one is a good example, right? Like that was like a very sort of formal declaration that that woman made. I am not going to eat meat again. She didn't even have to say I promise or I vow. She sort of made it permanent in her mind. And so
Uh-huh.
then having to change it required the Hatarat Nedarim. But most Nedarim, I don't think ever go to that formal requirement level.
Okay. The second reaction I had was the whole section about the father and the husband having the power to nullify a vow that when they hear of it. But the woman, of course, has no such power whatsoever. Her husband can make any vow he wants. And I'm what that to today's to our ears today, that sounds like some we don't live that way.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that's handled. Does anyone make vows these days? That's another thing I wonder about.
I think it is very unusual. Um, Meaning, we do Hatarat Nedarim sort of in a very broad way, in the month of Elul. Before Yom Kippur, we say Kol Nidre in Shul, but it's rare to have to actually nullify a vow. I'm trying to think of other examples that I've seen come up. If anyone has one, feel free to jump in with it. But it is very uncommon. It's an interesting question. Like, if I vowed that I was going to spend 8 hours a day learning Torah for the next month, Bli Neder, and my husband heard me in the next room and was like, "Oh no, if Yael learns Torah every day for 8 hours a day, who will watch our children? I'll do Hafarat Nedarim." That would cause a lot more stress than Shalom Bayit in my marriage, right? And similarly, if my husband made a similarly sort of foolish vow, not thinking about his obligation to our family, I too would want to be able to do Hafarat Nedarim because our relationship is much more mutual than the one laid out in the Torah for sure. Right? I think if anything, the parent to child is like a more comfortable analogy.
Yes.
Um, I don't know of any case of a husband trying to do Hafarat Nedarim on his wife.
Uh,
That's interesting. I wonder how I could search for that, right? That would be a really good test case. If a
yeah.
husband went to the Beit Din and said, I heard my wife say this, but I did Hafarat Nedarim and now she's insisting on doing it. I don't know what would happen, right? I think from a technical legal perspective, he would be within his rights according to the mitzvah.
Yes. Yeah. It's
It's uncomfortable, right? I feel uncomfortable with it. That's like why I think if I had had more time, I might have skipped it and done something else, but I didn't. So here we are. And I think it's okay for us to be uncomfortable with it. I think that if we lived in a culture of vow taking, we would probably have to come to terms with this, right? The
Hmm.
power dynamic would be uncomfortable. But because it's so rare that anyone makes a neder, and I don't think that most spouses use this mechanism, it hasn't come up in a way that we have to confront it. That's sort of my take. It's like a lot of the purity laws, I think, also might make us uncomfortable, but because like there are no Kohanim who have to go into the Beit HaMikdash and people who have to make sacrifices, like we just don't have to confront those elements that are uncomfortable at this moment. But that
Hmm.
could change in the future, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah.
But I agree. The things that bother you bother me too.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I have one thought. I was sitting here overwhelmed by the minutia, the complexity, and Yasher Koh, Yael, because you did that fabulously.
Well,
I'm
thank you. I
impressed.
tried.
I feel like a little um, insect of knowledge in view of everything that you said. But and then later on, as you went through the different applications, like I agree with Tamar, it's really a question: how seriously do we need to? How often do we need to take this literally? I,
Hmm.
I think I feel like my own level of knowledge and observance. I like to believe that this is sets up an framework for an attitude, uh,
Yeah.
permissiveness. Judaism has been accused by many people, Christians, etc., as being a legalistic religion. Like Christianity is a love religion and Judaism is a law religion.
Mm.
Well, it's not
Hmm.
true. I think in the argumentation, the back and forth that goes on, Ramban, and all the other Hillel and Shammai, it
Hmm.
shows that there is a preoccupation of hitting the right spot, not a absolute submission to one sentence like Islam does, or even
Mm.
Christianity. So we always leave things open because we are trying to find the permissive, the humane, we're choosing life every second of life, and I think
Hmm.
that's how I accept that. I don't know. Maybe I could be condemned as a heretic or saying something like this, but that's the way I see it.
That
So,
that the taking of vows or the annulling of vows?
Oh, well, both. The fact that we can
Hmm.
annul and forgive the annulment, that
Hmm.
you're not sentenced to be, you have to follow your vow. There is the fact that there is an annulment by itself is already a demonstration of tolerance and
Yeah,
acceptance.
I agree. Yes, I think that's the only way I can understand it that feels nice, is that when we say things in the heat of family debate, that our family can let it go for us. That's a beautiful thing. I agree.
I sort of have a slightly different perspective on vows. I think that somebody has an idea to be a vegetarian isn't a vow. I
Hmm.
think I think of involving Hashem,
Hmm.
that's a vow. You know,
Yes.
and so I think that's something that um, you really don't want to make vows as a general principle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that would be, um, and when it does happen, then it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So just having an idea versus a vow, I think, is much different.
Well, so the vows in Nedarim, a lot of them have to do with consecrating things, which I would say is sort of like what you were saying, right? About our relationship with Hashem, right? Like the word is I think it's konam, right? Which means like this thing is forbidden to me because I'm going to take it to the Beit HaMikdash, right? I've made this holy, and then there's no undoing of that, right? Or often they're about receiving benefit, which it really has nothing to do with Hashem, right? If you get mad at your neighbor and you say, well, I forbid that my neighbor to ever get
Yes.
benefit from me. So the Nedarim of the Gemara are like deeply in the weeds of like the words that we say. They're not all sort of grand vows to like be better people or daven more or believe in Hashem. Some of them are very, very small, right? This thing is forbidden to me, or I forbid this person to have benefit, or I abstain from something. It can be, right? One of the things like a Nazir is making a neder, right? I'm going to abstain from wine and cutting my hair and all of those things. And it's actually, as you're saying, it's very discouraged. That's why they have to bring a korban perhaps at the end of their period of Nazirut, is that it's like not really recommended to take such vows. But yes, I mean, the vegetarian one, I only keep bringing it up because I felt the same way you did. But Rav Ari asked Rabbi Dov Linzer, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Chov Beitar, where he was ordained, and Rabbi Linzer said she should do Hatarat Nedarim. I was surprised. But I think the vows are serious even when they relate to the physical world or to each other and not only to Hashem.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Rabbanit.
Yes. Hello, Rabbi Schwartz. Nice to see you.
Hi. Cute story first. I was having stomach
Yeah.
problems some years ago, and I said, I'm not eating cheese again.
Okay.
And then I was teaching, and the kids got pizza, and I was dying for a piece of pizza. I called Rabbi first. He says, you cannot eat the pizza until you take 3 bar mitzvah boys and make a beis din and matrim neder.
Yeah, it's like I actually think that even the fact that a thing like that is taken seriously heightens the Nedarim, right? In some ways, it like cheapens them. You can make a neder about cheese and pizza. On the other hand, it's like your words carry a lot of weight, and you have to be careful with them. Either way, it's a good example.
And then a very quick Dvar Torah, the Radomsker, the Tiferet Shlomo, says about Kol Nidre, we have those words, Isorei lo esarei,
Mm-hmm.
which means it's something that we forbade ourselves from eating or doing or whatever. But he says he is very, very pretty. He says that the Chazan and the 2 people on his side form a Beit Din, and they're being mater neder Hashem, because Hashem says in Yeshaya, I will not enter into the Yerushalayim Shalmala until the Jews are in the Yerushalayim Shalmata. I won't
Hmm.
go into the above Yerushalayim until the Jews are in the lower one. So what are
Mm-hmm.
they doing? They're saying to Hashem, Mutarlach, Machalach, your vow is nothing. Go into Yerushalayim.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
would add, especially now that we have Yerushalayim, so now Hashem should certainly be able to go into Yerushalayim Shalmala and give us the whole thing.
Hmm. I mean, that to me feels very similar to this parsha, right? When someone says something in the heat of frustration, the idea that Hashem would sort of say, it's okay. I'll let it go, right? We can annul that one. Not everything has to stand until it's over. Um,
Oh, I just thought of something.
yeah.
אם אשכחך ירושלים תשכח ימיני, תדבק לשוני לחיקי, אם לא אזכרכי. Is that a vow?
So I don't think so because it doesn't follow the formula, right? It's sort of hard to distinguish which is which. I'm going to put a link here. I think the idea of the vows is in some ways much more interesting than the annulment. Although what you said, Nelson, I think is beautiful about the annulment also. I don't know a lot about this rabbi, so take it with a grain of salt. But he talks about the sort of the words and how important words are, and like, do you have to follow a formulation or do you not? Does it have to be a lofty neder or a little neder? So that was just something I found yesterday that I thought was interesting. But I think that these are hard questions to grapple with. And until we can really understand the neder, it's hard to understand the importance or relevance of hafara or hatara. Um, right? If it just feels sort of ambiguous, which I think it does for most people, then the Hafarat Nedarim feels even more ambiguous and sort of uninteresting. But the idea that we could make the neder is the more interesting piece. So maybe we should have stuck there and not on the Hafara. But But there are ways to formulate your words that count as neders, and we should sort of be careful. I think saying bli neder is, to me, saying bli neder is like, just in case I don't really want to do this thing for you, right? Oh, I'll pick up your kids from school bli neder. I'm like, well, will you or won't you? Right? Like, I'm not interested in the extreme case where I have to let you out of your vow. I want to know if you're serious. So, like,
Do
I
you
don't
need
like
to,
that sort of verbal tick of bli neder. I would rather we just be a little bit more thoughtful instead of saying, like, I'm not going to be thoughtful and then I'll just say this magic formula. But on the other hand, I think it recognizes the seriousness at the same time. It reminds us of the power of our words every time we say bli neder. So, I don't
you
know.
need to have a witness to make an actual vow according to the formula?
Oh, great question. No, you do not. So then in that way, it's also self-reporting, right? Like if I said, I am taking upon myself a vow to make cupcakes usser, I cannot benefit from cupcakes, then it's totally on me. Or Rabbi Schwartz's example, if he said, Eliakim, I'm not gonna eat cheese, and then he wanted to just sort of let it go, right? He could have just eaten the pizza, no one would have known. He was very honest about it, right? And he said, no, I think this was a neder. But it does not have to be validated or certified. What's that word when you need someone to like watch you sign? Lawyers can do.
No,
Witness?
notarized.
Notarized, thank you. Right, it doesn't need to be a notarized vow to
Notarized.
count. Hello,
I-
Judith.
In trying to
But
think of,
the truth is also in Yiddish, when people use the word bli neder, they don't mean it as part of bli neder. They're basically saying something like a mitzvah shem, bli neder, I'm going to be there in a week or two.
Ah, that's very interesting. So you don't even think they're taking it seriously as a vow annulment mechanism. It's just a way of saying, I hope.
Yeah, it's like saying a mitzvah shem.
Hmm.
Mhm.
That's totally changed the whole thing. That's wild. Sorry, Judith, I cut you off. What did
no,
you
it's
have?
okay. I'm trying to think of a context where one could appreciate what it means to make a vow in our day and age. And frankly, the only things that come to mind are vengeance um,
I
thoughts.
mean, those are the
When
ones that most often discussed in the Gemara. I forbid
in the
benefit
heat,
to a neighbor.
yeah,
That's
but
the
in the
most
heat
common.
of anger, one
Hmm.
wants to turn the tables and do something destructive, to kill someone or otherwise destroy something about their reputation or whatever. And
Hmm.
I was thinking of a certain politician who found himself being humiliated at a public event. And when he subsequently came into power, he took it out on his rivals in every conceivable way, to the point of being, just unacceptable behavior. But you can see where
Hmm.
it's coming from. He had been humiliated and he vowed to make life miserable for these other people. And that kind of brings back King David's utterances to Shlomo on his deathbed, saying, this family, that family, and what they did to me. I've been kind to them, but you should not let their hoary heads go down to the grave in peace.
Hmm.
So where does that leave King Solomon, Shlomo? Um, there's a sort of a vow aroma around that.
Hmm.
His obligation to his father. I mean, but then comparable. I think of a certain group of World War II Jewish soldiers in Germany who made it their business after the war was over to go around um, finding German members of the German military or whatever who were responsible for the hundreds and thousands of deaths who never got prosecuted. And
Hmm.
they just saw that their hoary heads did not go down to the grave in peace, surreptitiously and illegally.
Hmm.
So they devote themselves to something passionately that, whether a
And
former vow is uttered, you can sense that the intent behind it is vow.
hmm. Well, so halachically, for a vow to take effect, it has to be uttered.
Uh-huh.
Right? Meaning you can't think it in your head. You have to say it out loud.
Hmm.
There's something about articulating, right, that I think does make things feel stronger. Right? When like I watch even my kids, right? Like when they look really angry and I'm sure they're thinking I hate you to their sibling, but if they yell I hate you, it like does really kick up the intensity to a different level, right? I think when you vow something out loud, it does sort of take on an added intensity, maybe is the way to say
Right.
it. And Hafarat Nedarim is also, right, is saying like, and I now cancel that, right? You can't
Mhm.
think any of these things. You have to say them out loud.
Right. Well, that's really an interesting conception in itself, that thinking it, you can find ways to get away from that. But once you
Mhm.
say it, it's like the words form reality for you or for other people.
Hmm.
I don't know where that idea comes from, but again, one senses it in the Jewish context that the words help shape reality, and therefore one has to be careful what comes out of your mouth.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's beautiful. An interesting piece of practical halacha, which I don't know, again, I think tomorrow, if people knew this, they might not feel so comfortable, is that if a man makes a vow, right, to be a vegetarian or whatever, and wants to annul it, he has to go to a beit din. But if a woman makes such a vow, she may ask her husband to annul it for her. She
Yeah.
doesn't have to go to a beit din. Right? If you made a vow in the heat of your anger about something, you don't have to admit it to three people on a beit din. You could just ask Jerry to annul it for you. Which again, there's like something beautiful and intimate about it, and there's something like a little bit uncomfortable about it, but you don't have to go to Jerry, but you could, which makes it a little bit different, I think, than for men. There's like a privacy to it, which is interesting. Anyway, this was such a beautiful discussion. I'm glad that we ended up learning it together. And I will not be here next week. I'm very sorry to say, although I'm very happy because I'm picking up my children from camp and I miss them very much. But I will be back the following week, which is, I believe, the 9 days Tuesday. And we will learn, hopefully, the mitzvah of the week for Naso, right? I think that's the Parsha in 2 weeks. So have a wonderful Shabbat and week and an early Shabbat Shalom. And also, I will end the following week and I will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
Enjoy
you.
the trip.